Hi, and welcome back to Heimler's History Economics Edition. In this video, we're going to talk all about unemployment, what it is, how to measure it, and what happens to it when labor unions and governments get involved. Let's get to it. All right, let me begin with a story. So after the dust settled in Germany after World War II, the country was essentially split between Western powers and Russia. So you had West Germany, which emerged as a new capitalist nation, and you had East Germany, which grew up under the influence of Russia and its communist economics. And for decades, West Germany flourished economically while East Germany struggled. Then, in 1989, a popular uprising deposed the communist dictatorship in East Germany. They tore down the Berlin Wall, which had symbolically and literally divided Germany, and now Germany was a unified democratic state. But all of a sudden, with the reunification, the unemployment rate soared in Eastern Germany, but not in Western Germany. In fact, the unemployment rate in Eastern Germany was about 12%, which was double what it was in Western Germany, despite a huge flow of resources into Eastern Germany from the German government to try to stave off the unemployment rate. And nothing seemed to touch it. Nothing seemed to work. Now, what in the world happened there? Well, that's essentially what this video is about, so let's see if we can figure it out. First, we need to get some definitions down. Unemployed people are people who do not have a job but are actively searching for a job. And the qualification there is that they must have been searching for a job in the last 4 weeks. So that means people like retired people who don't have a job are not technically considered unemployed because they are not actively seeking for a job. Neither are disabled people qualified as unemployed because they can't work. In fact, there's lots of categories of folks who are not considered unemployed even though they don't have a job. For example, there are people who want a job but have basically given up searching for one because the prospects of finding a job are just so poor. Those people are known as discouraged workers, and they are not counted in the unemployment rate. Also, we have the underemployed. Those are the people who are working part-time but want to be working full-time. They are not counted in the unemployment rate, even though they're looking for a job for the very simple reason that they have a job. So there's really only one category of people who are considered unemployed, those who do not have jobs but are actively searching for one. Okay, so let's talk about how economists measure unemployment, namely the unemployment rate. How is it that they get a meaningful figure to talk about unemployment? Well, what they do is they take a country's employed workers and then they add them to the unemployed workers, and then all together that's called a country's labor force. So if we want to find out what percentage of the working age population that is available for work, we can calculate a country's labor force participation rate as follows. The labor force participation rate equals the labor force divided by the population age 16 and older times 100. Why the population 16 and older? Because that is the working age in this country. Okay, so that's the labor force participation rate, but we can further calculate the unemployment rate with the following equation. The unemployment rate equals the number of unemployed workers divided by the labor force times 100. Now, you shouldn't get the impression that the U.S. Census Bureau is surveying every American household and figuring out everybody who has a job or does not have a job and is actively looking for one. That would be impossible, but instead what they do is they take a random sample of about 60,000 households and find out who has jobs and who doesn't and who's actively looking for them, and then they scale that up to the entire population. And therefore, the unemployment rate isn't an exacting and perfect measure of those who are unemployed in our country, but it usually is a good indicator of overall labor market conditions. And if you remember all those videos ago where we talked about the business cycle, you might have guessed that unemployment rises during recessionary periods and it falls during expansionary periods. And that's almost always the case, except sometimes in expansionary periods, unemployment can continue to rise. And the reason for that is that the expansion is not growing fast enough to outpace the level of unemployment that occurred during the recessionary period. Okay, now the question is, how low can the unemployment rate actually go? Now, you might be tempted to think that it's the same percentage of people at a monster truck rally who voted for Hillary Clinton, which is to say 0. And I just have to be honest with y'all, I recently went to a monster truck rally, and judging by the bumper stickers and t-shirts I saw, they emphatically did not vote for Hillary Clinton. Anyway, the lowest unemployment rate we've experienced in the last half century here in America is 2.9%, and generally speaking, if we're hanging out around 4%, we're pretty happy. Now, why is that? The reason why the unemployment rate will never be 0 is because we're not just just dealing with theoretical concepts here. We're dealing with real people and real jobs and real economies. I mean, think about it. Sometimes new industries are born and that creates some jobs, and sometimes industries die and that takes away jobs. Sometimes people leave perfectly good jobs so they can go find another job. And so all this time that people spend between jobs necessarily means that there will always be some level of unemployment. And it's entirely normal for a person to leave a job and then spend a few weeks looking for a new one. And during that amount of time, they will be classified as unemployed. In fact, and this shouldn't surprise you, economists have a term for that time spent between jobs. It's called frictional unemployment. And what they say is some frictional unemployment can actually be a good thing. It means that new jobs are being created and people are taking their time finding the right job and the right fit so that they can be the most productive that they possibly could be. So you can probably infer by everything I just said that when we experience times of higher unemployment, a smaller percentage of that can be considered frictional unemployment because people are having a harder and harder time finding jobs. But sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where there is a surplus of workers looking for jobs, and by the nature of a surplus, it means there aren't enough jobs for as many people as want them. You know, we've almost gone this whole video without a graph, and I can tell you're getting antsy, so it's graph time. Okay, so here's a supply and demand graph which gives us a picture of the labor market in equilibrium. Here's the equilibrium wage, here's the equilibrium quantity. Now at equilibrium there will still be some frictional unemployment because there's always some workers looking for jobs even when there are enough jobs for everyone. But there's a different kind of unemployment that I want to introduce you to, and that's called structural unemployment. So again, here's our equilibrium, the equilibrium wage, and the equilibrium quantity. And structural unemployment occurs when, for whatever reason, the wage hangs out above equilibrium. The most common reason for this is a government-imposed minimum wage, which, if you watch the video on price controls, you will remember that we call this a price floor. Now, if you'll remember, that means that there is more labor going to be supplied than there is labor going to be demanded, and what we have here is a surplus. So while it's perfectly natural to have frictional unemployment here, this surplus, all in here, is going to represent structural unemployment, which is a different thing altogether. So the imposition of a minimum wage is one way in which an economy experiences structural unemployment. But there are other means by which an economy might experience structural unemployment, and one of those is labor unions. Sometimes people join together in labor unions because it's easier to negotiate with firms when there's more voices all bound up together than there is with just a single voice. And when workers find that they have the power of negotiation, one of the first things that they ask for is higher wages. And if they are successful in driving their wages up above equilibrium, then what they have created are the conditions for structural unemployment. But firms can also get in on the fun. Sometimes, in order to attract more workers, firms will offer wages that are above equilibrium. And the technical term for this is efficiency wages. And again, when firms do this and push the wages above equilibrium, they are creating the conditions for structural unemployment. Okay, so we've got frictional unemployment and we've got structural unemployment. And when economists want to measure unemployment, they talk about the natural rate of unemployment. And if you want to know how to calculate that, and I know you do, then this is how you do it. Natural unemployment equals frictional unemployment plus structural unemployment. And by natural, they just mean that this is the level of unemployment that it is natural for an economy to experience. But as I mentioned earlier, sometimes there's more than natural unemployment. For example, if an economy enters a recessionary period. In that case, there is more unemployment than is natural. And economists call this cyclical unemployment. So now that we have all these terms defined, here's how to find the total number of unemployed people in a country. In order to find actual unemployment, we take natural unemployment and add it to the total number of the cyclical unemployment. Okay, now with all of that stuffed in our brain folds, let's go back to East Germany and try to find out what happened there. What happened is that after reunification, East Germany found itself battling severe structural unemployment. And if you'll recall, while they were divided, Eastern Germany was communist and Western Germany was capitalist. And what everybody knows about workers who work under a communist regime is that they do not benefit from working harder. And so for decades, the Eastern Germans learned to become less productive than their Western brothers and sisters. And so when reunification occurred, Western German wages were far above Eastern German wages. And so the East German labor unions fired themselves up and started demanding the same wages as their Western German counterparts. And that created a massive amount of structural unemployment because the wage rate was so much higher than equilibrium. And as we mentioned before, that creates the conditions for far more workers looking for a job than the market actually provides. And those Eastern folks who did find work did it at a much lower quality than those those did in the West. So what's the lesson of this video? Kids, don't become communists. I'll see you next time. Okay, thanks for watching. If you're a communist, then hit that like button below because I've now shown you a better way to live. And if you're a capitalist, then you probably should hit that like button also because you don't want the communists to outwork you. And if you found this video helpful, then consider subscribing to this channel and joining the Heimler family. Bye.